A broke single father trying to sell his daughter's favorite handmade toy at a market never expected the mysterious woman who bought it to be a lonely billionaire who would change his life forever. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The sawdust danced in the slivers of morning light that cut through the garage window, each particle a tiny ghost of a tree that had once stood tall. Leo sat on a worn stool, his back aching with a familiar complaint, his hands moving with a grace that belied their callous texture. He was carving a bird, a small wren with wings half spread as if caught in a moment of decision, to stay or to fly. The wood was birch, smooth and pale, and smelled of cold earth and new beginnings. He'd found the fallen branch in the woods behind their small rented house, a gift from a storm that had passed through last week. His daughter Maya sat on the floor nearby, a stack of books forming a wobbly throne beside her. She was 7, with eyes that held the quiet depth of an old soul and a laugh that could shatter the thickest silence. She wasn't watching him, not directly, but he could feel her presence like a low, steady hum, the anchor in the choppy waters of his life. She was coloring, her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth in concentration as she filled a page with a swirl of impossible blues and greens. He glanced at the half-finished wren in his hands, its head tilted with a curious, almost hopeful expression he hadn't intended to carve. It was her favorite. She'd named it Pip. "Is Pip ready to see the world, Daddy?" she'd asked him last night, her small fingers tracing the unfinished curve of its wing. He had smiled, a tired thing that didn't quite reach his eyes, and said, "Almost, sweet pea. He's just a little shy." The truth was, Leo was the one who was shy. Shy of the numbers that screamed at him from the stack of envelopes on the kitchen counter. The one with the red border from the landlord was the loudest. Rent due, final notice. Words that felt like stones in his throat. He'd lost his job at the furniture factory 3 months ago when they downsized, shipping the work overseas to a place where hands were cheaper and dreams were smaller. Since then, he'd been surviving on the whispers of odd jobs, a broken fence here, a wobbly bookshelf there, and the small, intricate wooden toys he carved in this garage. They were beautiful things, animals mostly, each one with a personality that seemed to emerge from the grain itself. But beauty didn't pay the bills. He ran his thumb over the wren's back, feeling the smooth, perfect grain. He had to sell it. He had to sell all of them. The thought was a cold weight in his chest. These weren't just toys, they were stories, pieces of a life he was trying to hold together with wood glue and hope. Each one was a conversation he'd had with Maya, a memory of a walk in the woods, a quiet afternoon spent in the shared sanctuary of this dusty garage. Selling them felt like selling off pieces of their history, one small animal at a time. He looked over at Maya again. She was humming now, a tune with no beginning and no end. She didn't know about the red envelope. She didn't know the pantry was down to a half-empty bag of rice and a few cans of beans. She just knew her dad could make magic out of wood, that he could make birds that looked like they might sing. He set the wren down carefully, picked up a fine grit sandpaper, and began to smooth its edges, his movements slow and deliberate. He would make it perfect. It was the least he could do for a piece of his heart he was about to give away. The decision had settled in his chest overnight, a cold, hard knot that wouldn't dissolve with the morning coffee he couldn't afford to brew. He had to go to the market. The Saturday craft fair in the town square was a bustling, chaotic place filled with potters, painters, and women who crocheted hats that looked like vegetables. It wasn't his world. His world was the quiet scent of cedar shavings, the patient rasp of a file against wood, the solitary focus of bringing something to life with his own 2 hands. But the world of the market, the world of commerce and cash boxes and polite smiles, was the one that held the key to keeping the lights on for another week, to keeping the red-bordered envelope from turning into an eviction notice. He told Maya over breakfast, 2 slices of toast with the last scrape of jam shared between them. He explained it carefully, his voice low and steady, trying to keep the tremor of his own fear from bleeding into his words. He said they were going to have an adventure, that they were going to show everyone the beautiful animals he'd made. He didn't say it was because they were out of options. He didn't say it was because his pride, the thing he'd guarded so fiercely since her mother was gone, had finally worn thin enough to see through. She looked at him, her dark eyes unblinking, her toast held halfway to her mouth. She glanced at the shelf by the door where the small wooden menagerie lived, the fox with the sly grin, the lumbering bear, the timid deer, and Pip the little wren who now sat finished and gleaming. "All of them?" she asked, her voice small. Leo nodded, his own throat tight. "Just for a little while." He lied, and the lie tasted like ash. "We're going to find them new homes where they can have new adventures." She was quiet for a long moment, and he braced himself for tears, for the kind of childhood protest he wouldn't have the strength to counter. But Maya was different. She had been born with a quiet resilience, a way of understanding the things he couldn't bring himself to say. She finished her toast, hopped off her chair, and walked over to the shelf. She picked up Pip, holding the small wooden bird in both hands. She whispered something to it, too quiet for him to hear, then she kissed its head and placed it carefully into the worn cardboard box he'd set by the door. "Okay, Daddy," she said, turning back to him with a wobbly but determined smile. "Let's find them a good home." And in that moment, Leo felt a surge of love so fierce it almost brought him to his knees. It was a love tangled with a profound and aching guilt. He was her father, her protector, the one who was supposed to build a world where she never had to be brave, where her favorite toys didn't have price tags. But the world he had built was cracked and leaning, and he was asking his 7-year-old daughter to help him hold it up. He knelt and pulled her into a hug, burying his face in her hair, which smelled faintly of sunshine and sleep. "You're the best kid in the whole world," he whispered. She squeezed him back, her small arms a lifeline. "I know," she said, and for the first time that day his smile was real. They would go to the market. They would face the crowds and the noise and the indifference. They would do it together. The old truck groaned in protest as Leo turned the key, the engine catching with a rattling cough that sounded like it was clearing its throat of a long-held complaint. The check engine light had been on for 6 months, a constant, glowing reminder of a problem he knew how to fix but couldn't afford the parts for. It was a cruel irony for a man who spent his life mending things. He loaded the boxes of wooden toys into the truck bed, each one packed with old newspaper to keep them from chipping. He handled the boxes with a reverence that felt more like he was transporting relics than inventory. Maya sat in the passenger seat, buckled in with Pip the wren clutched in her lap. She had insisted on carrying him herself, a silent, solemn guardian of their most precious cargo. When they arrived at the town square, the market was already a kaleidoscope of color and sound. Tents of every shade dotted the green, vendors shouted greetings, and the air was thick with the competing smells of kettle corn, lavender soap, and grilling sausages. Leo found his assigned spot at the far edge of the lawn, a small forgotten patch of grass next to a gnarled oak tree, away from the main flow of foot traffic. He unfolded his wobbly card table, the one he'd found on the curb last year, and draped it with a faded blue bedsheet. He arranged the toys with meticulous care, creating a small, enchanted forest on the worn fabric. The fox peered out from behind the bear, the squirrel perched on a makeshift branch, and the deer stood poised as if listening for a distant sound. They looked beautiful, out of place, like wild things captured and put on display. He'd made the signs himself last night, hand-lettered on scraps of cardboard. Hand-carved wooden animals, made with love. He didn't list a price, hoping to engage people in conversation, hoping they'd see the story in the grain before they saw the number on the tag. Maya helped, her small hands arranging acorns and pine cones around the display, her seriousness a stark contrast to the festival atmosphere around them. As the morning wore on, a slow parade of people drifted past. They'd slow down, their eyes catching on the miniature world he'd created. "Oh, how charming," a woman in a wide-brimmed hat would murmur before being pulled away by her husband toward a stall selling brightly colored glass beads. A young couple would stop, pick up the bear, feel its weight in their hands. "This is incredible," the man would say, the craftsmanship. But then they'd see the unwritten price in Leo's tired eyes, the quiet desperation he was trying so hard to hide, and they would set it down gently, offer a polite smile, and move on. Each time it happened, a small piece of Leo's carefully constructed hope chipped away. He tried to smile, to engage, to tell them about the wood, about the hours spent with a knife and a piece of his soul, but the words felt hollow in the noisy air. He felt invisible, his quiet craft drowned out by the louder, shinier, cheaper things that surrounded him. He was a whisper in a room full of shouts. Maya seemed to feel it too. She had started the day with a bright, hopeful energy, but now she sat quietly on an overturned crate behind the table, her chin resting in her hands, watching the river of people flow past without stopping. He wanted to tell her it was okay, that they could pack up and go home, but he couldn't. The red-bordered envelope was waiting. He had to stay. He had to keep trying. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the back of Leo's neck. The initial trickle of market-goers had turned into a steady stream, a river of faces that flowed past his stall with a frustrating and consistent lack of interest. He had adjusted the display 3 times, repositioning the little wooden owl to catch the light, turning the fox to showcase its most cunning angle. Nothing worked. The world, it seemed, was in a hurry, and his quiet, patient craft belonged to a slower time. He sold one piece, a small, simple fish that a grandfather bought for his grandson. Leo had asked for $10. The man had handed him a 5 and said, "It's for a kid, he'll probably lose it anyway." Leo had taken the $5, the crumpled bill feeling like both a victory and a profound defeat. His stomach growled, a low, embarrassing rumble. He hadn't eaten, wanting to save the last of the bread for Maya's lunch. He watched her now, her small form slumped on the crate. The initial excitement of the day had long since evaporated, replaced by the quiet boredom of a child who had been promised an adventure and had been given a lesson in invisibility instead. He reached into their bag and pulled out the sandwich he'd made for her, along with a juice box. Her face lit up, a small, temporary sunbeam in the gloom of the afternoon. "Thanks, Daddy," she mumbled, her mouth already full. As she ate, she watched the other stalls. She saw the woman selling tie-dyed shirts, laughing with a customer. She saw the man with the pottery wheel, his hands covered in clay, surrounded by a small crowd of onlookers. Then, her gaze fell on their own table, on the silent, still forest of animals waiting for a home. She finished her juice, crushed the box in her small fist, and slid off the crate. She walked to the front of the table, picked up Pip the wren, and held it up to a woman who was walking by. "He knows how to fly," Maya said, her voice clear and serious. The woman, startled, stopped and looked down at the small girl and the wooden bird. She smiled, a polite, dismissive expression. "That's very nice, dear," she said, and walked away. Maya's shoulders fell. She didn't cry. She just placed Pip back on the table, its head tilted, as if watching the woman go. She walked back to her crate, the light in her eyes a little dimmer than before. Leo's heart ached. This was his failure, not hers. He was the one who couldn't make them see. He was the one who couldn't turn his love and his skill into something the world valued. He was just a man with a wobbly table and a pocket full of sawdust, trying to sell his dreams for grocery money. And his dreams, it seemed, weren't worth very much at all. He was about to suggest they pack it in to surrender to the day when a shadow fell across the table. He looked up, expecting another passer-by. But this was different. The man was tall, dressed in a crisp linen shirt and expensive-looking sunglasses that hid his eyes. He radiated an aura of impatient wealth. He didn't browse. He scanned, his gaze flicking over the toys with a critical, appraising air. "How much for the lot?" the man asked, his voice clipped and dismissive, as if he were buying commodities, not art. The question caught Leo off guard. The whole table?" "Yes," the man said, tapping a polished fingernail on the table's edge. "I've got a chain of boutique hotels. These would look quaint in the lobbies. Give me a price." Leo's mind raced. This was it. The miracle. The one big sale that could change everything. He did a quick, desperate calculation in his head, a number that was both fair for his work and high enough to make a difference. $300, Leo said, his voice steadier than he felt. The man scoffed, a short, sharp sound of derision. 300? For firewood? They're charming, I'll give you that. But they're not art, I'll give you 50. Cash. $50. For weeks of work. For the stories and the memories and the piece of his soul he'd carved into each one. The offer was an insult, a slap in the face disguised as a business transaction. Leo felt a hot flush of anger creep up his neck. He looked at the man's smug, hidden face, and then he looked at Maya, who was watching them with wide, worried eyes. He couldn't let her see him be belittled. He couldn't sell his dignity for $50. He took a slow breath, the air thick with the smell of kettle corn and his own rising pride. "No, thank you," Leo said, his voice quiet but firm. "They're not for sale at that price." The man shrugged, unbothered. "Your loss," he said, and turned to walk away, leaving a trail of cold indifference in his wake. The interaction had taken less than a minute, but it had drained the last of Leo's resolve. He sank onto the edge of the crate, the anger giving way to a hollow, aching emptiness. He had failed. He had stood his ground, but his dignity wouldn't pay the rent. He felt Maya's small hand on his arm. "It's okay, Daddy," she whispered. Pip didn't want to go with him anyway. He looked mean. Leo managed a weak smile and pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. He didn't want her to see the tears that were stinging his eyes. He had one last shred of his pride to protect, and that was her belief in him. They would pack up, they would go home. He didn't know what they would do tomorrow, but for today, the market was over. He had just started to carefully wrap the fox in newspaper when a woman's voice, soft but clear, cut through his thoughts. "Excuse me," she said. "I hope I'm not too late." Leo looked up, his movements slow. She was standing at the edge of his stall, her hands tucked into the pockets of a simple, well-worn trench coat. She wasn't dressed like the other market-goers. There was no flashy jewelry, no designer handbag. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and her face was bare of makeup, revealing a spray of faint freckles across her nose. She had kind eyes, the color of moss after a rain, and they were fixed on the wooden animals with an expression of genuine wonder. He hadn't seen her approach. She moved with a quietness that was at odds with the noise of the fair. She seemed to exist in her own pocket of stillness. Leo straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans out of habit. "No, not too late," he said, his voice still rough with the dregs of his earlier encounter. "Just starting to pack up for the day." "Oh, good," she said, a small, relieved smile touching her lips. She stepped closer, her gaze drifting from the stern-looking badger to the delicate fawn. She didn't touch them, not at first. She just looked, her head tilted, as if she were listening to them. "They're alive," she said, more to herself than to him. The words were so simple, so different from the condescending, quaint or charming he'd heard all day. He felt a small, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. "I try to make them that way," he said. She finally reached out, her fingers gently tracing the back of the bear. Her hands were elegant, with long, slender fingers, but her nails were short and unpolished. A single, simple, silver ring was the only adornment. "My grandfather used to carve," she said, her voice dropping a little. "He made me a little wooden horse. I carried it everywhere until the legs wore down to nubs." She looked up at him then, and her smile was a little sad, a little nostalgic. "You have his hands," she said. "He always said the story was in the hands." Leo didn't know what to say to that. It was the most profound compliment he'd received in years. He just nodded, a lump forming in his throat. He watched as her gaze fell on Pip, the little wren still clutched in Maya's hand. Maya, who had been watching the woman with silent intensity, held the bird out slightly, an offering. The woman knelt down, so her eyes were level with Maya's. "And who is this little fellow?" she asked, her voice soft. "This is Pip," Maya said, her voice barely a whisper. "He's the bravest." "I can see that," the woman said, her eyes twinkling. She didn't patronize. She spoke to Maya like an equal, a fellow connoisseur of small, brave things. She looked from the bird to Maya, and then up to Leo, and in that one look, he felt something shift. He wasn't just a failed vendor at a craft fair anymore. He was a father, an artist. He was seen. The woman, who had yet to give her name, stood up slowly, her gaze returning to the collection of animals spread across the blue bedsheet. She seemed to be making a decision, her brow furrowed in thought. The harsh afternoon sun had softened, casting long shadows across the grass, and most of the other vendors were beginning to pack up their wares. The smell of kettle corn had faded, replaced by the scent of cooling asphalt and damp earth. Leo felt a familiar sense of resignation begin to creep back in. She was kind, but kindness didn't change the fact that he was leaving with an almost empty cash box. He braced himself for the polite, "Thank you," and the inevitable turning away. But she didn't turn away. "I'll take them," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Leo blinked. "I'm sorry?" "All of them," she repeated, her gaze sweeping across the table. "The fox, the bear, the owl, all of them. How much?" The question was the same one the other man had asked, but the tone was entirely different. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a genuine inquiry. Leo was so stunned he couldn't form a number. His mind went blank. He just stared at her, trying to process the words. Was this a joke? Pity? He looked for some sign of condescension in her eyes, but found only that same calm, mossy sincerity. Maya, however, had no such hesitation. She stepped forward, her small face serious. "You want Pip too?" The woman looked down at her and smiled gently. "Especially Pip," she said. "If he's for sale." Leo finally found his voice, though it was raspy. I was asking 300 for the set." He said it almost as an apology, expecting her to balk, to tell him it was too much. She didn't even blink. "That's not nearly enough," she said. Leo stared at her, completely bewildered. "What?" "For the materials," she said. "The hours, the soul you put into them. 300 is a bargain. I'll give you 5. 500? Leo stammered, the number sounding foreign and impossible on his tongue. He had never held that much cash in his hands at once. "No," she said, a small, almost mischievous smile playing on her lips. 5,000. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. $5,000. The sound of the number echoed in the sudden silence of his mind. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. This woman, this quiet, kind-eyed stranger in a worn trench coat, was either crazy or an angel. He suspected the former. "I can't accept that," he said, shaking his head, taking a half-step back. That's too much. It's not right." "Why not?" she asked, her head tilted. "Is that not what they're worth?" He was speechless. Of course they were worth that. In a world that valued time and heart and skill, they were worth even more. But this wasn't that world. This was a world of $5 bills from grumpy grandfathers. "I don't even have a way to process a payment that large," he said, grasping for a practical objection. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a simple, slim leather wallet. From it, she produced a wad of cash, crisp $100 bills held together by a simple money clip. She counted out 50 of them, her movements quick and efficient, and held the stack out to him. "No processing needed," she said. Leo just stared at the money, then at her face, searching for the catch. There was always a catch. But her expression was open, patient. She wasn't playing a game. He looked at Maya, whose eyes were as wide as saucers. She was looking at the money, yes, but she was also looking at the woman, a look of awe on her face. This was magic. Real, tangible magic happening right in front of them. He took the money, his hand trembling slightly. The bills felt unreal, like stage props. He couldn't bring himself to count them. He just held the thick stack, the weight of it both a relief and a burden. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of something he couldn't name. Gratitude, yes, but also a deep, unnerving sense of being off balance, of being rescued by a force he didn't understand. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "You don't have to say anything," she said softly. "Just keep carving." And with that, she began to carefully pack the wooden animals into the boxes he had brought, handling each one with the same care he would have. He watched, still stunned into silence, as the last of his creations disappeared into the cardboard, ready for a new home he couldn't imagine. The transaction was complete before Leo's mind had fully caught up to the reality of it. The woman, who had introduced herself only as Clara, helped him pack the last of the wooden figures, her movements gentle and deliberate. She treated each piece not as merchandise, but as something precious. When the boxes were sealed, she didn't ask him to help carry them to her car. Instead, she produced a small, foldable dolly from the trunk of a surprisingly modest, clean, but not new sedan. She loaded the boxes herself, refusing his offer of help with a quiet shake of her head. "You've done the hard work already," she said. "This is the easy part." He stood there, holding the thick stack of cash, feeling useless and overwhelmed. The money felt hot in his hand, a brand of her kindness that he didn't know how to carry. He had 1,000 questions. Who was she? Why had she done this? What did she want? But the questions were stuck in his throat, a tangled knot of pride and disbelief. As she was about to close her car door, Maya, who had been watching the entire exchange in silent awe, ran forward. She held Pip the wren in her outstretched hands. "You forgot him," she said. Clara turned and knelt, her eyes softening as she looked at the little bird. "Oh, sweetie, I didn't forget him. I think he belongs with you." "But we sold him," Maya said, her voice filled with a child's unwavering sense of fairness. "You paid for him." "I did," Clara agreed. "And now I'm giving him back. As a gift. Every brave bird needs a safe nest to come home to." She gently closed Maya's fingers around the wooden wren and gave her hand a soft squeeze. She stood up and looked at Leo, her gaze direct and clear. "I'll be in touch about a potential commission," she said, giving him a reason, an excuse for the exorbitant amount of money she'd given him. "I'll need your contact information." Leo fumbled for a scrap of paper, his hand still shaking as he scribbled down his name and the number for the cheap burner phone he used. He handed it to her, their fingers brushing for a brief moment. Her skin was cool, and the touch sent a jolt through him, an unexpected spark of connection in the midst of his confusion. "Thank you?" he said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "Truly." She just nodded, gave one last, soft smile to Maya, and got into her car. She drove away without a backward glance, leaving Leo and Maya standing in the middle of the emptying market, the setting sun casting long golden shadows around them. They were alone, with a cardboard box containing a single wooden bird, and a stack of cash that felt more like a dream than reality. Leo looked down at the money, then at his daughter, who was clutching Pip to her chest with a look of pure, unadulterated joy. He didn't know who Clara was, or why she had just walked into their lives. But as he looked at the hope shining in Maya's eyes, he knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. The drive home was a blur. Leo kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting on the stack of cash in the passenger seat, as if he needed to physically touch it to believe it was real. The truck's engine still coughed and sputtered, the check engine light still glowed defiantly, but for the first time in months, the sounds didn't fill him with a cold dread. They were just sounds. Problems that could be fixed. Problems that money could solve. Maya was quiet in her seat, cradling Pip in her lap, her small face illuminated by the passing streetlights. She wasn't chattering about the market or the strange, kind woman. She was just content. It was a stillness he hadn't seen in her for a long time. When they got home, the first thing Leo did was walk to the kitchen counter and pick up the stack of envelopes. He opened the one with the red border, the one from the landlord, and smoothed it out. He took 5 of the crisp new bills, folded them neatly, and slid them into the return envelope. The relief was so sudden, so profound, that he had to lean against the counter for a moment to steady himself. He could breathe. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he could draw a full, deep breath without the weight of impending doom pressing on his chest. "Daddy?" Maya's voice came from the doorway. "Are we rich now?" He turned and smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes and crinkled the tired skin around them. "No, sweet pea," he said, scooping her up into his arms. "We're not rich. We're okay. And right now, that feels even better." For dinner, they didn't have rice and beans. They went to the local diner, the one with the cracked vinyl booths and the waitress who always called Maya Sugar. Leo ordered a cheeseburger with extra bacon, a chocolate milkshake, and a slice of apple pie for them to share. He let Maya order whatever she wanted, and she chose pancakes with whipped cream and sprinkles, a breakfast feast for a celebratory supper. He paid with one of the new $100 bills, and the waitress's eyes widened. "Hit the lottery, Leo?" she asked with a grin. "Something like that," he replied, and for once it didn't feel like a lie. Later that night, after he had tucked a happy, exhausted Maya into bed, Leo sat alone in the quiet of his garage. The workbench was empty. The space where the wooden animals had once stood now a stark void. It should have felt sad, but it didn't. It felt like a beginning. He looked at the money still sitting on the passenger seat of the truck, a silent testament to the day's impossible events. He still didn't understand it. He didn't understand her. Clara. The name was as simple and unadorned as she had seemed. But there was nothing simple about what she had done. It wasn't just about the money. It was the way she had looked at his work, the way she had spoken to his daughter, the way she had seen him, really seen him, in a way no one had in years. He thought about her promise to call, the talk of a potential commission. He told himself it was just something she'd said to make the charity of it all less stark. A polite fiction to preserve his dignity. He didn't expect her to actually call. People like that. People who could hand over thousands of dollars without a thought. They didn't move in the same world as men who carved toys in dusty garages. They were a different species altogether. He ran a hand over his face, the stubble scratching his palm. He was tired, but it was a good kind of tired. The kind that comes after a long day of hard work that has finally, impossibly, paid off. He picked up the block of birch he'd been saving and a fresh, sharp knife. He didn't know what he was going to carve yet, but he knew he had to, because she had told him to. Just keep carving. The next 2 days passed in a strange, dreamlike state. Leo woke up each morning, half expecting the money to have vanished, for the whole experience at the market to have been a figment of his sleep-deprived imagination. But the cash was still there, tucked safely in an old coffee can on the top shelf of his closet. The landlord had his rent, the pantry was stocked with more than just beans, and the check engine light in the truck suddenly seemed less like a threat and more like a suggestion. He spent the money carefully, with the cautious hand of a man who knew how quickly it could disappear. He bought Maya a new pair of shoes to replace the ones with the worn-out soles. He bought a new set of carving knives, the sharp German steel feeling impossibly luxurious in his hands. He even bought a real coffee maker, and the rich, dark aroma that filled the house the next morning felt like the ultimate symbol of his new, fragile prosperity. But amidst the relief and the small, practical luxuries, a quiet unease began to settle in. Who was Clara? He replayed their brief interaction over and over in his mind. The way she moved, the quiet confidence in her eyes, the simple but clearly expensive cut of her coat. There was a story there, one that didn't quite line up with her unassuming demeanor. The potential commission she'd mentioned felt more and more like a polite lie, a gentle way of letting him down easy. He told himself it didn't matter. She had given them a lifeline, a clean slate. It was more than anyone had ever done for him. He owed her a debt of gratitude that he could never repay, and he had to be okay with never seeing her again. He threw himself into his work, the new knives moving through the wood with a renewed sense of purpose. He carved a new collection of animals, not for sale this time but for Maya. for their home. He carved a wise old owl, a playful squirrel, and a magnificent stag with intricate antlers. The garage was once again filled with the soft scent of sawdust and the quiet focus of creation. Maya was thrilled. She spent hours arranging the new figures on her shelf, creating elaborate stories and adventures for them. She still slept with Pip, the wren tucked under her pillow, every night. On the third day, his phone buzzed. It was a number he didn't recognize. His heart gave a sudden, sharp lurch. He answered, his hand unsteady. "Hello? Leo? It's Clara." Her voice was just as he remembered it, calm and clear, but with an undercurrent of something he couldn't quite place. He leaned against the garage wall, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. "Clara, hi. I wasn't sure you'd call." "I said I would," she replied, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "I hope this is a good time. I was wondering if we could talk about that commission." A commission. She had meant it. The relief was so sharp, it almost felt like pain. "Yes, of course," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "Whenever is good for you. How about tomorrow? I could stop by your workshop. Say, around 10? Here?" he asked, his mind immediately picturing the dust, the oil stains on the floor, the general state of organized chaos that was his sanctuary. "If that's all right," she said. "I'd love to see where the magic happens." He agreed, his mind already racing. He had less than 24 hours to make his dusty, cluttered garage look like a place where magic happens. He had to clean, he had to organize. He had to somehow transform his humble workshop into a place worthy of a woman who had, in the span of 10 minutes, completely upended his world. The panic was a new and unwelcome sensation. For the first time, he wasn't worried about money. He was worried about her. Clara arrived at 10 o'clock on the dot, pulling up in the same modest sedan she'd driven at the market. Leo had spent the entire morning in a cleaning frenzy, sweeping the floors, organizing his tools, and even wiping down the windows until they gleamed. The garage still smelled of sawdust, but it was a clean, crisp scent now, a workshop at its best. He had been so focused on the space that he hadn't thought about himself until he caught his reflection in the newly cleaned window pane. He was wearing his usual work clothes, a faded flannel shirt, and jeans stained with wood varnish. There were still traces of grime under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could remove. He was who he was, a man who worked with his hands. He hoped that would be enough. He watched from the doorway as she got out of the car. Today, she wore a simple black turtleneck and dark jeans, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She carried a large leather portfolio under one arm. She looked less like a mysterious benefactor and more like an architect or a designer, someone with a clear and creative purpose. He met her at the door, his heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his ribs. "Hi," he said, his voice a little too loud in the quiet morning air. "Come on in." She stepped inside, her eyes immediately scanning the space. She took in the neat rows of tools hanging on the pegboard, the stacks of lumber sorted by type, the half-finished carving on his workbench. A small, approving smile touched her lips. "This is a wonderful space," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "It feels honest." "It's a garage," he said with a shrug, feeling the need to downplay the pride that swelled in his chest. "It gets the job done." "It's more than that," she insisted, running a hand over the smooth, worn surface of his workbench. "This is where you make things that matter." He didn't know how to respond to that, so he just gestured to a stool he'd cleared for her. "Can I get you something? Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine, thank you," she said, sitting down and placing the portfolio on her lap. "I don't want to take up too much of your time." The formality of her words created a small, awkward distance between them. This wasn't the kind, spontaneous woman from the market. This was a client, a professional. He leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms, waiting. She opened the portfolio. Inside were not architectural drawings or corporate charts, but beautiful, detailed sketches of birds, dozens of them. Wrens, finches, sparrows, hummingbirds, all captured in mid-flight, their wings rendered with an artist's eye for detail. "These are incredible," he said, his professional curiosity overriding his personal anxiety. "Did you draw these?" She nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "It's a hobby. Something I do to quiet my mind." She looked up at him, her expression turning serious. "I work for a company that's building a new children's hospital. The main atrium is going to have a large-scale mobile, a flock of birds suspended from the ceiling. We've been looking for an artist to create them. When I saw your work at the market, the life you put into them, I knew you were the one. A hospital, a mobile. It was a real project, a massive one. It was the kind of commission artists dreamed of. It was also terrifying. I've never worked on that scale before," he said honestly. "My pieces are small, they fit in your hand." "I know," she said, "but the skill is the same. The heart is the same. I believe you can do it." Her faith in him was a tangible thing, a weight and a lift all at once. She explained the details, the timeline, the budget. The numbers she mentioned were staggering, enough to secure his and Maya's future for years to come. It was a lifeline transforming into a bridge to a world he had never imagined being a part of. He should have been elated, but as she spoke, a question nagged at him, a small, persistent splinter of doubt. What kind of company had a budget like this? What kind of woman with a hobby of sketching birds could greenlight a project of this magnitude? The pieces didn't fit. She was more than just an employee, more than just a designer. There was a story here she wasn't telling, and a single, simple silver ring on her finger suddenly seemed less like a choice and more like a costume. The meeting concluded with a handshake, a formal agreement to move forward. Clara promised to send over the official contracts and a down payment to cover materials. As she packed up her portfolio, a small sound from the house caught her attention. The back door creaked open, and Maya appeared, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, with Pip the wren clutched in her hand. Her face lit up when she saw Clara. "The bird lady!" she exclaimed, running into the garage and straight to Clara, wrapping her arms around her legs in a fierce hug. Clara, startled at first, softened instantly. She knelt and returned the hug, her professional demeanor melting away, replaced by the same genuine warmth Leo had seen at the market. "Hey, sweet pea," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she seemed to be trying to suppress. "I see you're taking good care of Pip." "He sleeps on my pillow," Maya said proudly. "He keeps the bad dreams away." She looked up at Clara, her head tilted. "Are you staying for lunch? Daddy makes the best grilled cheese, even when it's a little burnt." Leo stepped forward, a flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck. "Maya, honey, Clara is a very busy woman. She has work to do." But Clara was already shaking her head, a real, unguarded smile spreading across her face. "I am never too busy for slightly burnt grilled cheese," she said, looking from Maya to Leo. "If the offer's real," Leo hesitated. The thought of this elegant, mysterious woman sitting in his small, cluttered kitchen, eating a simple sandwich at his wobbly table, was both terrifying and deeply appealing. It felt like a line was being crossed, a boundary blurring between the professional and the personal. He looked at Maya's hopeful face, and then at Clara's, which held a similar, though more subtle plea. He let out a slow breath, a sigh of surrender. "The offer's real," he said, "but I can't make any promises about the burnt parts." The grilled cheese was, in fact, slightly burnt. Leo had been so nervous his hands had been unsteady, and he'd left the sandwiches on the skillet a few seconds too long. He served them on mismatched plates, along with a glass of milk for Maya and water for the adults. The kitchen felt small, smaller than usual, with Clara's quiet presence filling the space. She didn't seem to notice the peeling linoleum or the faucet that dripped with a slow, rhythmic plink. She sat at the small table, listening intently, as Maya recounted a long, rambling story about a squirrel in their backyard. She laughed in all the right places, asked thoughtful questions, and treated Maya's every word as if it were the most important thing she'd heard all day. Leo watched them from the counter, a dish towel in his hands, feeling like an observer in his own home. He was struck by how natural it felt, having her here. It had been so long since a woman's laughter had echoed off these walls. After his wife Sarah had passed, the house had fallen into a quiet, functional rhythm. It was a space for him and Maya, a fortress against the world. He hadn't let anyone in, not really. But Clara had walked in without even asking for the key. After lunch, Maya, fueled by sugar and excitement, eventually crashed, falling asleep on the couch with Pip nestled beside her. A soft, comfortable silence settled over the house. Leo found Clara in the living room, standing by the mantelpiece, looking at a framed photograph. It was a picture of him and Sarah, taken on their wedding day. They were young, beaming, the whole world stretched out before them. She was beautiful, Clara said softly, not turning around. She was, Leo replied, his voice thick. She was the architect of our lives. I was just the builder. Clara finally turned to face him, her eyes filled with a deep, empathetic sadness. I'm so sorry, Leo. He just nodded, the grief, a familiar, dull ache. It's been 3 years, he said. But some days it feels like yesterday. I just try to keep her alive for Maya, in the stories I tell. You do more than that, Clara said. You've built a beautiful life for her, a world full of love and safety. Her words were a balm on a wound he didn't realize was still so raw. He had been so focused on what he couldn't provide, the money, the stability, the mother she deserved, that he had forgotten to see what he had managed to create. I don't know about beautiful, he said, looking around the small, worn-out room, but it's ours. That's what makes it beautiful, she insisted. She stepped closer, her gaze searching his. You're a good man, Leo. The world doesn't have enough of them. He felt a blush creep up his neck, unused to such direct, sincere praise. He was used to being judged by the state of his truck, the balance in his bank account. She was judging him by the state of his heart. The air between them crackled with an unspoken energy, a connection that was growing too strong to ignore. He could smell the faint, clean scent of her perfume, a mix of rain and something vaguely floral. He saw the way the light from the window caught in her hair, turning it the color of warm honey. He felt a pull, a longing he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He cleared his throat, taking a step back, breaking the spell. The vulnerability was too much, too soon. I should get back to the garage. He stammered. The contracts. Of course, she said, her smile faltering just a little. She understood. She retreated, giving him the space he was asking for, but her eyes held a hint of disappointment. He had built his walls high for a reason, but for the first time, he found himself wishing he knew how to tear them down. A week later, a courier delivered a thick manila envelope to Leo's door. Inside were the contracts for the hospital mobile project, along with a check for the down payment. The number on the check made Leo's head spin. It was more money than his father had made in a decade of working at the mill. It was life-changing. It was terrifying. He signed the contracts, his hand surprisingly steady, and got to work. The project consumed him. He spent long hours in the garage, transforming the space into a production workshop. He bought new equipment, better lighting, and vast, beautiful sheets of basswood and maple. The garage was no longer just a place of quiet, solitary creation. It was a place of ambitious, focused industry. He hired a young Hurd, apprentice from the local community college, to help with the sanding and finishing, and for the first time, the garage was filled with the sounds of two people working in tandem. Clara became a regular visitor. She would stop by a few times a week, always under the guise of checking on the project's progress. But they both knew it was more than that. She'd bring coffee or sandwiches from the local deli, and she and Leo would talk while he worked. They talked about everything and nothing, the stubbornness of a particular piece of wood, Maya's latest school project, the way the light changed in the afternoons. They never talked about her life, her world outside of this small, dusty garage. It was an unspoken agreement. Here, she was just Clara, the woman with the kind eyes and the portfolio of bird sketches. She was a natural with Maya. She'd sit with her for hours, drawing, reading, or just listening to her endless stories. She taught her how to fold origami cranes, their small paper flocks soon joining the wooden one on the shelf. Leo would watch them, a strange mix of joy and apprehension twisting in his gut. It felt so right, so easy, having her here. It felt like they were a family, and that was the most dangerous feeling of all. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Clara arrived looking pale and distracted. She was quieter than usual, her smile strained at the edges. She watched Leo work, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. "You okay?" he finally asked, setting down his carving knife. She looked up, startled, as if pulled from a deep, troubled thought. "I'm fine," she said, but her voice was thin. "Just a long day." He didn't believe her, but he didn't push. Later, as she was leaving, her phone rang. He saw the name on the screen before she could hide it. "Charles." Her face tightened, and she quickly silenced the call, shoving the phone back into her pocket. "I have to go," she said abruptly, and left without her usual warm goodbye. The incident was a small tear in the carefully woven fabric of their new reality. It was a reminder that she had a life beyond these walls, a life with people named Charles who made her face cloud over. It was a reminder that he knew nothing about her, not really. That night, unable to sleep, he found himself sitting in front of his old laptop, the one he rarely used. He hesitated for a long moment, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. It felt like a betrayal, a violation of the unspoken trust they had built. But the doubt was a poison, and he needed the antidote of truth. He typed her name, Clara, into the search bar, then paused. He didn't know her last name. He typed in what he did know: Clara and Children's Hospital Art Commission. The results loaded, and the world tilted once more. The first hit was a press release from a major philanthropic foundation. Ashworth Foundation announces partnership with New City Children's Hospital for atrium installation, and there, in the first paragraph, was her name. Clara Ashworth, the foundation's chairwoman, and the sole heiress to the Ashworth Global conglomerate. The article was accompanied by a photo. It was her, but not his Clara. This Clara was dressed in a sharp power suit, her hair in a sleek, severe style, her smile polished and professional. She was standing next to a group of men in suits, shaking hands with the mayor. She looked powerful, untouchable, a woman who moved in circles so far above his, he couldn't even imagine them. He clicked on her name, and the story unfolded. Billionaire heiress, philanthropist, a shrewd businesswoman who had taken over the family empire after her father's retirement. There were articles about her company's stock prices, her real estate holdings, her place on lists of the world's most influential people. There was even a short, vague mention of a highly public, acrimonious split from a man named Charles Devon, a rival tycoon. Charles. The name from her phone. It all clicked into place. The money, the commission, her quiet elegance, her reluctance to talk about her life. She hadn't been lying. Not exactly. She had just omitted the billion-dollar truth. Leo leaned back in his chair, the glow of the screen illuminating his stunned face. The woman who ate his burnt grilled cheese, who laughed at his daughter's silly jokes, who had looked at him with such sincere warmth, was one of the wealthiest women in the country. The garage, his sanctuary, suddenly felt very small. The project, his great opportunity, now felt like a handout. And the fragile, beautiful thing that had been growing between them felt like a lie. He didn't feel anger. Not yet. He just felt a deep, hollow coldness. He had been a project, a diversion, a quaint little carpenter who provided a brief, charming escape from her real life. He had let her in. He had let himself hope, and he had been a fool. The next day, when Clara arrived at the workshop, the air was different. The scent of sawdust was still there, the tools were still in their places, but the warmth was gone. Leo was polite, professional, his responses to her questions clipped and concise. He didn't meet her eyes. He kept his focus on the half-finished wooden eagle on his workbench, his knife moving with a sharp, aggressive precision. Clara felt the shift immediately. The easy camaraderie they had built was gone, replaced by a tense, formal distance. She tried to bridge the gap, asking about Maya, telling a funny story about her drive over, but her words fell into the silence and died. "Leo, what's wrong?" she finally asked, her voice soft. He didn't look up. "Nothing's wrong. The project is on schedule." "This isn't about the project," she said, stepping closer. "This is about us. You're barely looking at me. Did I do something?" He finally set down his knife and turned to face her, his eyes cold and hard. "I know who you are, Clara, or should I say, Miss Ashworth." Her name, her real name, hung in the air between them like an accusation. She flinched, her face paling. The color drained from her cheeks, and she took an involuntary step back. "Leo, You should have told me," he said, his voice low and tight. Each word a carefully controlled release of the hurt and anger that had been simmering all night. "You let me believe you were just someone. You let me welcome you into my home, into my daughter's life, all while you were playing a part." "It wasn't a part," she insisted, her voice trembling. "This was the only place I felt like I wasn't playing a part. This was the only place I could just be Clara." "Clara who?" he shot back. "Clara, the woman with a hobby of sketching? Or Clara Ashworth, the billionaire who can buy and sell entire towns like this one, who can hand out million-dollar hospital commissions like they're party favors?" "The money doesn't change who I am," she pleaded. "It changes everything," he exclaimed, his voice finally breaking, the raw emotions spilling out. "It changes the way you saw me. It changes what this is. I wasn't a man you met at a market. I was a charity case, a sob story you could fix with your checkbook." "That is not true," she cried, tears welling in her eyes. "I saw you, Leo. I saw your heart, your talent. I saw the way you love your daughter. That has nothing to do with money. Doesn't it? Would you have even noticed me if you weren't looking for a new pet project?" The words were cruel, and he knew it the moment they left his mouth, but he couldn't take them back. He wanted to hurt her the way he felt hurt. He wanted her to feel the sting of his humiliation. Her face crumpled, the tears now streaming down her cheeks. She didn't try to defend herself further. She just stood there, absorbing the blow. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, filled with the wreckage of what they had built. "I never, for 1 second, thought of you as a project," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I thought of you as a friend, maybe more." He just shook his head, turning his back on her, unable to look at her tears, unable to face the possibility that he was wrong. "I think you should go," he said, his voice flat. She stood there for a long, heartbreaking moment. Then she turned and walked out of the garage, the sound of her footsteps fading on the gravel. The door swung shut behind her, leaving Leo alone in the sudden, crushing silence, the smell of sawdust mingling with the bitter scent of regret. Life after Clara was a study in gray. The sun still rose, the coffee still brewed, and the work in the garage continued. But the color had been drained from Leo's world. He moved through his days like a ghost, his actions mechanical, his heart a hollow, aching space in his chest. He finished the mobile for the hospital, his hands moving with a skill that felt disconnected from his soul. The wooden birds were technically perfect, their wings carved with precision, their forms sanded to a flawless finish. But they were lifeless. The spark, the indefinable essence that had made his earlier work so special, was gone. He delivered the finished pieces on schedule, his interaction with the hospital foundation brief and professional. He never mentioned Clara's name, and they didn't either. The final check arrived in the mail, another staggering sum that he deposited into his bank account without a flicker of joy. The money was a constant, bitter reminder of her, of the lie, of his own foolish, hopeful heart. Maya felt the change most acutely. Her father was there, but he wasn't. He didn't laugh as much. He didn't tell stories while he carved. He was a quiet, sad version of the dad she knew. "Is the bird lady ever coming back?" she asked one night at dinner, her voice small and tentative. Leo's hand froze, his fork hovering over his plate. "I don't think so, sweet pea," he said, his voice gentle but firm, a tone that discouraged further questions. Maya didn't ask again, but a shadow fell over her bright spirit. She stopped leaving her origami cranes on the workshop bench. She played with Pip the wren less often. The house grew quieter, the silence between them filled with the unspoken name of the woman they both missed. Leo tried to fill the void. He took Maya on trips to the park, to the library, to the zoo. He bought her new books and art supplies. He tried to be both father and mother, friend and playmate. But he couldn't replicate the easy, natural warmth that Clara had brought into their lives. He couldn't fake the light she had sparked in both of them. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer, he found a small, folded piece of paper. It was one of Clara's sketches, a quick, simple drawing of a sparrow she had left behind on one of her visits. He unfolded it, his fingers tracing the delicate pencil lines. It was just a bird on a piece of paper, but it was so full of life, so full of her. He sank onto the floor, the sketch held in his hands, and the grief he had been suppressing finally broke through. It wasn't just anger he felt, it was loss, a profound, gut-wrenching loss. He had pushed her away. He had let his pride and his fear build a wall so high that she couldn't climb it. He had accused her of seeing him as a project, but in the end, he was the one who couldn't see past the money, past the name. He had let her real self be obscured by the billion-dollar shadow she cast. And he was suffocating in the lonely, quiet world he had chosen. Clara sat in the sterile silence of the Ashworth Global boardroom, a ghost at the head of a long, polished table. The room was filled with men in dark suits, their faces grim, their voices a low drone of quarterly reports and market projections. She was physically present, her posture perfect, her expression a carefully constructed mask of neutral competence, but her mind was miles away, in a dusty garage that smelled of cedar and hope. She had returned to her world, the world she had once run from and then run back to. It was just as she remembered, cold, demanding, and utterly devoid of joy. The days were a blur of meetings, conference calls, and strategic decisions that affected thousands of people but touched her in no meaningful way. Charles Devon was back in her orbit, a constant, smirking presence at the edge of her vision. He had been a partner at a rival firm, and their personal and professional lives had once been deeply, disastrously intertwined. After their public split, he had made it his mission to undermine her, a slow, patient campaign of corporate warfare. Now, with the Ashworth board sensing her distraction and vulnerability, they had brought him in as a consultant, a move that was a thinly veiled threat. He watched her across the table, his eyes glinting with a triumphant cruelty. He knew she was wounded, and he was circling like a shark that had scented blood. She ignored him, focusing on the papers in front of her, but his presence was a constant, grating reminder of her past failures, of her own poor judgment in trusting someone so completely. Her apartment, a minimalist penthouse overlooking the city, felt less like a home and more like a beautifully designed prison. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the city below. She had everything money could buy: art, comfort, security, but she was achingly, profoundly lonely. She missed the sound of Maya's laughter. She missed the scent of Leo's workshop. She missed the taste of burnt grilled cheese. She missed the man who had looked at her, not at her bank account. One evening, she found herself in her home studio, a space she hadn't entered in months. Her sketches were still pinned to the wall, the birds still frozen in mid-flight. She picked up a charcoal pencil, the feel of it familiar and foreign in her hand. She tried to draw, but her hand was stiff, her lines lifeless. The magic was gone. It had lived in a small garage, with a man who thought she was just Clara. She put the pencil down and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the glittering expanse of the city. She had built an empire, but she had lost herself in the process. Leo had accused her of playing a part, and he was right. She had been playing the part of Clara Ashworth, the powerful, untouchable heiress, for so long that she had forgotten how to be anyone else. But in a small, unassuming town, for a few brief, beautiful weeks, she had remembered. She had been just Clara. and she had never felt more real. That was the life she wanted, the self she wanted to be. But she had let fear and a man's wounded pride chase her away from it. The question now was whether she had the courage to fight her way back. The knock on the door came late one evening, soft but insistent. Leo wasn't expecting anyone. He opened the door to find a courier, a young man in a crisp uniform holding a femme flat, rectangular box. There was no return address, just his name printed in elegant, familiar script. He took the box, his heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat. He carried it to the kitchen table and carefully cut the tape. Inside, nestled in a bed of tissue paper, was a wooden bird. It was a wren, intricately carved, its wings half spread, its head tilted with a look of quiet curiosity. It was a perfect replica of Pip, the one he had carved for Maya. But this one was different. It was made from a dark, rich walnut wood, and around its tiny leg was a simple silver band engraved with a single word, "Sorry." He lifted the bird from the box, its weight familiar in his palm. He turned it over. On the underside, burned into the wood, was a small, elegant Clara. He sank into a chair, the wooden bird clutched in his hand. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a check or a contract. It was a piece of art, a piece of her heart. It was an apology in a language they both understood. It was her, reaching across the chasm of their two worlds, speaking to him not as a billionaire, but as a carver. The gesture undid him. It shattered the last of his prideful anger, leaving only the raw, aching truth of his own regret. He had been so wrong. He had been so blinded by his own insecurities that he had pushed away the one person who had seen him for who he truly was. He looked at the bird, at the single, perfect word engraved on its leg. Sorry. He was the one who was sorry. Sorry for his cruelty. Sorry for his fear. Sorry for letting the best thing that had happened to him in years walk out the door. He didn't know if it was too late. He didn't know if the damage was irreparable, but he knew he had to try. He had to answer her gesture with one of his own. The next morning, he went into the garage. He found the most beautiful piece of maple he had, a piece with a grain that flowed like water. And he began to carve. Clara was in the middle of a tense board meeting when her assistant interrupted, her face pale. "Miss Ashworth, there's a delivery for you." "It's in the lobby." Clara frowned. "I'm not expecting anything." "He said it was personal," the assistant whispered. "He insisted on bringing it up himself." Charles Devon smirked from across the table. "Another suitor, Clara? Do be more careful with your choice of carpenters this time." Clara shot him a look that could freeze fire, then stood and walked out of the room, leaving the board in a stunned silence. In the lobby, standing by the massive marble reception desk, was Leo. He was holding a large, cloth-wrapped object in his arms. He looked completely out of place in the cold, corporate expanse of the Ashworth Tower, with his worn flannel shirt and work boots. He looked tired, nervous, but determined. He looked like the man she had fallen in love with. She walked toward him, her heart pounding. "Leo, what are you doing here?" "I got your bird," he said, his voice low. "I came to deliver mine." He carefully unwrapped the object. It was a carving, a sculpture of two hands, one large and calloused, the other slender and elegant. The hands were clasped together, holding a single, fragile sapling between them. It was a masterpiece, a stunning piece of art that spoke of connection, of partnership, of new growth. "It's for you," he said. "It's my apology. I was a fool, Clara. I was scared, and I was proud. And I pushed you away. I was so afraid of your world that I didn't see you. I am so sorry." She stared at the sculpture, her eyes filling with tears. She reached out and traced the lines of the carved hands, her fingers lingering on the space where they met. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "No," he said, finally meeting her eyes, his own gaze raw and vulnerable. "It's honest." In that moment, the noise of their two worlds fell away. There were no boardrooms, no bank accounts, no headlines. There were just two people, a man and a woman, standing in a marble lobby, offering each other their broken, hopeful hearts. "I miss you," she said, her voice cracking. "I miss you too," he replied. "More than I can say." A quiet understanding passed between them, a silent agreement that this was not an end, but a new, more honest beginning. They left the Ashworth Tower together, leaving the sculpture, the board meeting, and Charles Devon's smug face behind them. They walked out into the city sunlight, not as a billionaire and a carpenter, but as Leo and Clara. They didn't know what the future held. They knew it would be complicated, that their two worlds would not merge easily. But for the first time, they were ready to face it together. Their first step was a small one. They went to a quiet, unassuming cafe a few blocks away, a place with mismatched chairs and the smell of fresh-baked bread. They sat for hours, talking, really talking. For the first time, he told her about his fears, his insecurities, the crushing weight of trying to be enough for Maya. She told him about her loneliness, the suffocating pressure of her family's legacy, the betrayal that had taught her to never trust anyone. They laid their broken pieces on the table, and instead of judging, they listened, they understood. It was a slow, patient process of rebuilding. Clara started spending weekends at his small house, not as a visitor, but as a part of their lives. She and Maya would spend hours in the garden, planting flowers. She would sit in the garage while Leo worked, not as a client, but as his partner, offering ideas, sketching designs, or sometimes just providing a quiet, steady presence. She never tried to change him or his world. She didn't offer to buy him a bigger house or a fancier truck. She knew that what he had built, with his own two hands, was more valuable than anything she could purchase. Instead, she invested in him. She saw the potential in his quiet craft, the magic in his hands. Together, they developed a plan. It wasn't a corporate takeover. It was a partnership. They decided to open a small, high-end gallery in the city, a space dedicated to showcasing the work of unknown, self-taught artisans like Leo. It would be a place that valued heart over hype, craftsmanship over mass production. Clara would fund it, her business acumen providing the structure. But Leo would be its soul, its curator, its guiding spirit. He would find the artists, the other quiet creators working in dusty garages and forgotten studios, and he would give them the chance he had never had. The project gave them a shared purpose, a common ground where their two worlds could meet and create something new and beautiful. It was a bridge built of trust and mutual respect. Of course, it wasn't easy. The press was relentless at first, the headlines a mix of cynical speculation and saccharine fairy tale narratives. Billionaire heiress to bankroll carpenter boyfriend's art gallery. Charles Devon and his allies on the board tried to paint it as a frivolous pet project, another sign of Clara's emotional instability. But this time, Clara didn't run. She stood her ground. With Leo by her side, she faced the board, the press, the world. She spoke not of profit margins, but of purpose. She spoke of the importance of investing in human potential, of creating something that nourished the soul, not just the bottom line. Her conviction was unshakable, and slowly, the narrative began to shift. People started to see not a scandal, but a story of authentic connection. They saw a woman using her power not for personal gain, but to lift others up. They saw a man whose quiet dignity and immense talent were finally being recognized. They saw a partnership built not on convenience, but on love. The gallery, which they named the Wood Wren, opened on a crisp autumn evening. The space was beautiful, all clean lines, warm lighting, and natural materials. It was filled with stunning works of art carvings, pottery, hand-woven textile saw from artists Leo had discovered on his travels. In the center of the gallery, on a simple pedestal, was his own sculpture of the two clasped hands. It was the heart of the show, the symbol of their journey. Leo, dressed in a simple but well-fitting suit that Clara had insisted on buying him, stood by the entrance, greeting guests. He was nervous, but he wasn't scared. He belonged here. This was a world he had helped build. Clara moved through the room with an easy grace, her smile genuine, her eyes shining with pride. She wasn't Clara Ashworth, the heiress. She was Clara, Leo's partner. Later in the evening, as the crowd thinned, they stood together in front of his sculpture. Maya, who had spent the night charming every guest, was asleep on a small couch in the office, Pip the wren tucked under her arm. "We did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through her elegant ones. "No," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We're just getting started." The light in the gallery was soft, the city lights twinkling through the large front window. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a real one, messy and complicated and more beautiful than either of them could have ever imagined. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most valuable things in life aren't the ones you buy, but the ones you build together.